Thank you very much, John, for that very comprehensive introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here. I should say that I have given upper house seminars before, but I haven't actually given one, since the 1980s. So this is it's a welcome return. And when I gave the last day of upper house seminar, Hector Kaplan was the lecturer, so that sort of brings us back to I think that was about the North Cemetery and Praisos. Anyway, this is about a completely different subject. What you see in front of you is a picture from our 2007 excavations at Praisos. And it's, you see in front, there's a trench there, that's a trench there, that's a trench, well, that's A200, that's a trench A300, and behind it is a very large building. That large building was excavated quite some time ago by earlier excavators by R.C. Bozogay, who was also a director of the British School at Athens. So there's a long tradition of studying this site from this institution. But I want to sort of frame this talk not as an account of an excavation, what we did and what we found, but in more, as it were, theoretical, historical terms, trying to problematize think about a problem that I think ancient historians and archaeologists share when looking at what John called post-Bronze Age, post-Bronze Age, Iron Age and later Greece. And that is the problem of we have lots and lots of little political communities that manage to function quite successfully, even though they're tiny. So leads on to my next slide. And we start off with Praisos. Praisos is one of the 49 known archaic and classical polis, usually translated as city-states. I want to use W.G. Runciman's term citizen-state, because I think that better characterises what these things were, that we find in Crete, which is in turn one of 1,035 such political communities that are known. This is from the Hanson and Nielsen catalogue of known archaic and classical polis. That's an awful lot of independent, autonomous political communities. Now, in the past, these things have been written about by ancient historians, and if you ask most ancient historians, is a polis a state? They will say, of course. Most, but not all. There's been some discussion about whether what we call a citizen state can be a state in comparative terms. That is to say, does it stand up to the kind of criteria that an anthropologist coming from someone like Ann Arbor in Michigan would apply to a state? Is it big enough? Does it have the right levels of administration and hierarchy that characterises states almost everywhere, except in this part of the Aegean at this particular time? And they would say no. So someone like Joyce Marcus, who studies the Maya, would say, no, these aren't states, these are chiefdoms. Now, anyone who knows anything about archaic and classical world, this is an absurd idea, the notion that they're chiefdoms, because they're not big enough to be states, therefore they must be chiefdoms. But other people, like this guy Berendt, who wrote an article in Classical Quarterly in 2000, attacking the idea that classical Athens was a state, saying, no, it's not a state, it's some kind of other kind of community, it's not a state. So this critique, using anthropological ideas, has come also from within classics. And this creates a problem. How do these communities function on a level that's equivalent to larger political structures further to the east, the kingdoms of Lydia, the kingdoms of Assyria, and these are larger structures, larger power centres, which seem to operate quite well. How do these very small communities function? It's a particularly problem in Crete. We have 49 known political communities in Crete. It's quite possible, we've got Donald Haggis here, but there are more than 49. that maybe 60 or so, maybe around before 500 BC, but possible that there are some of them which just disappeared and never got into the literary record. So just to look at Crete for a bit, how do you explain how is it that Greek states were effective? Well, the most traditional answer is the hoplite one. Because they had hoplites, they managed to function as effective military powers, therefore they managed to function as effective states. And how do you explain hoplites? Well, we explain hoplites as being bringing in people who are no longer who are outside the aristocratic clique. The whole notion of an aristocratic clique is also something that's been critiqued quite heavily recently. The notion that there are some primordial aristocracies in archaic Greece, I think, is no longer sustainable after Alan Dupuis' book, but that's another problem. And there's a whole set of ideas invested in hoplites. The problem with that is this hoplite explanation only really works for the Peloponnese. There are lots of other parts of the Aegean and Mediterranean world. We have Greek-speaking political communities that aren't quite so focused on hoplites. And there's the idea that Ian Morris has been championing since 1987 about this notion of isonomia. The idea of citizenship became manifested and can be seen in the burial record of Athens, at least around the 8th century BC, and this created citizen states. And more recently, the Dutch scholar Josine Bloch has come up with a slightly different idea, which is one I want to run with, which is that these things managed to function because they were essentially covenants between gods and men. But they were there's a kind of deal between your deity and you. You create a sense of citizenship by essentially feasting with the gods, or the patronage of the gods, through sacrificial ritual. And this is an idea that Josine Bloch has been developing a number of articles, and well, she's writing a book about it. If you can get Robin Osborne's a letter published at CUP, but that's another problem. So, Crete. In Crete, these political are even smaller than elsewhere. So this is a comparison I did with various other islands, where we have Sicily. So this is the size of the island, this is the number of political communities, and that's the average size, so 467 square kilometres. Cyprus, there are probably fewer than 12 Basileia or Polites in Cyprus, so that's probably more than 771. Euboea, about 307. And then Crete, they're really tiny, 170 square kilometres is the average size. That's just on the 49. If we have 60, which we may well have, that number would be even smaller. And so we use this comparison. So if you're looking at it in British terms, this is less than half the size of the Isle of Wight, which is quite small, I think. Again, from a comparative perspective, these places are too small to be viable political structures. So just looking at some of the major sites I'm going to be talking about, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of these central Cretan major sites. These are some of the major cities of Crete. This is a major sanctuary site that I'm going to be talking about later. Dreros, which the French and Greeks have been reinvestigating, Azuria out there, and Praisos here. Right, I'm also talking about commensality. I want to propose that a possible or a major factor in how to explain how it is that these communities were viable as political communities, and how it is that they managed to do without the kind of elaborate administrative structures that Near Eastern political communities depended upon, is, or might be, commensality. Here we run into some methodological problems. Ancient historians, again, familiar with the whole range of Greek terms that are used for various kinds of commensality. So everyone's familiar with the notion of the symposium. Most people, especially experts on Sparta, are familiar with the notion of syssition. And those people who study ancient Crete are very familiar with this notion of the Andreon. It's quite clear from a range of ancient sources, which I'll come to in a second, which are given in the handout, that these are all various forms of commensality. So we have these ancient Greek terms. We also have a whole bunch of terms used by anthropologists to define various kinds of commensality. In particular, Chicago-based anthropologist Dietler, who's drawn the distinction between diacritical feasting, so a symposium is a form of diacritical feasting, whereby a group of people mark themselves out by a distinctive style or manner of consumption. And patron-role feasting, where people, there is a patron and everyone feasts on the patron. That is the way of sort of showing their, as it were, obligations towards that patron. Well, I'm suggesting that animal sacrifice might follow that latter category. And this is something that you can get an idea developed when you see the block. But there's also another problem. In a sense, there's these categories. There's a tendency in ancient history to reify ancient Greek terms. So we have this notion of the rise of the polis. And the polis isn't the way ancient Greek talked about their political communities. It's kind of reified, ancient historical, specialised term that's now being used. So people don't talk about states, they talk about the polis. I want to suggest that that is actually a kind of dead end using this terminology. Creating reified, pseudo-emic terms like this is never going to result in better understanding of what's going on. We have to think more clearly about the categories we use. And if we use anthropological categories, then we have to relate them to the kind of phenomena we're trying to describe. And in archaeological terms, that means deposits, which must relate to certain kinds of behaviour, and I'll come on to that in a second. Now, it's quite clear that in many Greek political communities, commensality is important and is linked to citizenship and is linked to the function of the state. And an obvious example, if you know your classical Athens, is the deposits that have been dug up by our American colleagues in the Agora that relate to the Royal Stoa and to the Tholos, where there seems to be communal dining and where the people seem to have been assigned, these are public dining cups with a DE, a ligature on the bottom, DE standing for demosion. So this is public property and these people are dining at public expense. And there's a whole series of things one can do with dining at public expense in classical Athens. And this is a privilege of a group of people who are basically the executive committee for that month running Athens. And with their duties as the executive committee of Praisos went the privilege of dining together, in particular in that building, the so-called Tholos, which is not to be identified with the Critenea, which we now know is in a completely different part of Athens. But that's another kind of... In Crete, though, we know quite a lot from Veritate sources, and this is again in your handout, about this institution. In particular, we know from a long passage in Strabo, who quotes Epirus about how this institution functioned in the 4th century BC. There are earlier references, so there's some reference to the Andrean Alcman, so that takes us back to the Archaic period. And there are lots of other references from the 4th century BC onwards. And this is supported by epigraphic evidence, which again takes us back to about 600 BC. We have early inscriptions from Altinia, Axos, and Gortin, which mention this institution as being an important political institution within these Cretan communities. And there's also found prominently on this thing, which again, if you're an expert, if you know anything about Archaic Crete, you'll recognise immediately as the Spensilios Mitra, which is a contract between Spensilios, who will be the Ponikastes and Ponikastes, the remembrance and scribe of the community of the Dactylites, whoever they are, and will also have, also states his dues to the Andrea as part of the kind of deal with being the kind of person who records public and divine matters for this particular political community. Okay, that's well known. The problem comes with archaeologists trying to find the Andrea. Where is the Andrea? Now, the assumption in classical archaeology, if there's an institution, there is a building to go with that institution. So if there are Praisos, there must be a building. If there is a boulé, there must be a bouliteria, etc. This works for the classical period, more or less. We do find buildings that go with institutions. I don't think it really works for the archaic period. And there is a tendency, especially in Crete, for any large building to be called an Andrea. So some find a large building just to the west of Heraclium, it's Apollonia. It's a big building, must be an Andrea. Virtually any big building excavated in Crete has been, at one point or another, been called an Andrea. And in this particular site, we've got two candidates for this particular function. One was, it is Drieros. One was excavated by Xanthidides around 1918, and this was excavated by Marinatos in the 1930s, and also it's where the whole series of inscriptions comes from around here. Recently, it's pity that Alexander Farnley can't be here, because recently the French and Greek team have gone back to Drieros and re-investigated this and re-investigated that. In fact, they've gone through Xanthidides' dump. One of the themes of this talk is going through other people's dumps is actually quite fruitful. Re-excavating dumps can tell you quite a lot, and that's what they've been doing here. But that's a digression. What I really want to point out here is that, at least in this site, one can plausibly argue that the hearth temple at Drieros, that these things have been argued by people like the French and others, these things were multifunctional. Certainly that's very plausible for the site of Commos, where there's certainly evidence for extensive dining taking place. So that's another one of these hearth temples. But here, Xanthidides found various bits of armour. So we have these small buildings where you find armour, several of them in archaic and classical Crete, and we have these other buildings that might have functioned in temples. And either or both of them might be Andrea. And you can have a big argument about which is the Andrea. My reading of the evidence is that if you read between the lines in Strabo, Ephoros, he implies that there's more than one Andrea per polis. That would be my, if there's an ancient historian here who knows Ephoros very, very well, then might be able to shoot me down in flames. But I think that's the implication. He consistently uses the plural when applying to particular communities. So I think it's quite possible that in the case of Drieros, both of these buildings at times function as Andrea. And we mustn't think that a building, that an institution is tied to a building, or indeed that an institution necessarily is tied to a place. It's an institution, it's a series of events. So it may not be tied to either. It could have taken place there, or it might not have done. And that's a kind of, again, that's a kind of set of expectations we have from working back to the classical period to the archaic, and expecting to find what is familiar. And I don't think that necessarily works. Donald's here, so he tells more about this. But in Azuria, they found several buildings. They found this monumental civic structure. Am I right, Donald? And they've also found another building which you call an Andrea, and we found a bit of armour. So again, we have these two possible candidates in a sense. I'm putting interpretations on your site here, which is going a bit far, but it's quite, I think it's quite possible to take different kinds of. And you also find evidence that, if I'm right, kitchens down, kitchens and things down here, correct. Okay. It's quite a complex, it doesn't fall into our presuppositions that there's domestic space and there's public space. Clearly there's something slightly different going on in archaic Crete, which doesn't fit into our categories of domestic and other things. Our own categories, that is. Okay, let's get to Praisos. This is what Praisos is in relation to Azuria here, and so Palaeostro, someone from the Palaeostro, but there's also, more importantly, there's also the city of Etanos up here, Praisos, Iraputna here, and Azuria here, whose ancient name we don't know, but clearly must have been some kind of a political community in the archaic period. That's where it is. I'm going to go into the history of excavation here a little bit. This has been excavated by quite a lot of people. First President Albert, in the late 19th century, who excavated all over the place. And then R.C. Bosanquet. One of the places that R.C. Bosanquet excavated was this large plaster structure. First slide shows you another view of this large plaster structure. And this is a view here of our excavation taking place. That's one of his photographs. He called it by two names. He called it the Arbitrary House, after this, and he also called it the Andrea, because it's a great big building with a monumental facade. And there are very few large buildings of plaster-dated monumental facades in Crete. Certainly, if you look at, if you go by my colleague Whitley in Cardiff has written a very important article about Cretan houses in the classical and Hellenistic period, and they are generally very small structures, two-room structures. We have an Italian organal in here, and we can tell you about a very small structure at Tripitos, which dates the Hellenistic period. And this seems to be something that goes through Cretan history. You can look back at Azuria again. When you have houses, they're one of two-room structures largely. Now they're not very keen on tiles until very, very late. We have found tiles here, but that's another story. And so this is an unusually complex building with many rooms, with, again, a monumental facade here. And it seems to be earlier than these structures here and these walls here. So here, Bosanquet got this wrong. He said these were earlier houses. Let's go up there and have a look and see if these things butt onto this wall. They're later houses, not earlier houses. So this must date to a period before the time of the thing's destruction. Now, Bosanquet excavated this in 1901. It's fairly clear he didn't supervise it very closely. He gives a 2-page report in the BSA about what he actually found here. I think it's also clear to me that I would argue that various things that he did find, like evidence of there's evidence of an olive press. If you go to the site today, you'll see evidence of an olive press. I think that's much related to a later use of the structure, possibly after the site was destroyed around 140 BC. We came back here in 2007, and we had the experience of having to buy the land twice. The land had been bought by Bosanquet in 1901, and he said it's been lodged with the Cretan government, and no sign of records of this could be found, and the land had been claimed since by the local people. So we had to buy the land again, and we can excavate it. So it's been bought twice by the British. So I think it doesn't have to be bought for a third time in the future. This is what we found in one trench that's just outside. And this relates to one thing I should just talk about by way of, which is the date of the so-called destruction, because Praisos says the site was destroyed by its neighbour Hiraputna. And this can be dated by reference to an inscription from found in Monitopulu. I'm not going to go into that particular problem now, but it's pretty clear it was destroyed by 140 BC, between 145 and 140 BC, when the Romans' backs were turned, when they were involved with Corinth and Carthage. The Hiraputnians synced up and sort of destroyed Praisos. So we infer from the finds, including this coin, which dates to the middle of the 3rd century. That this is it's not a destruction horizon in the sense that those of you familiar with something Minoan Crete, the Bronze Age Crete, we have a fire destruction. There's no fire destruction here. There are little bits of charcoal from the hearth, but there's no fire destruction. It seems to have been a forced abandonment. And what's interesting in the case of this forced abandonment is what they left behind. And one of the things they were forced to leave behind is the family Pythos, or several family Pythoi. And this is another. You could give several talks about Praisos. You could talk about ethnicity, material culture. You also talk about this phenomenon, which has become apparent in recent years in Crete, which is this habit of Cretans to hang on to their Pythoi for several hundred years. So the Epidamos, Pythos from Praisos, other ones from Praisos, several other examples keep on turning up with 8th to 7th century Pythoi, which you find in destruction or abandonment horizons of the middle 2nd century BC. And this Pythos is older than this house in which it's set, which is, again, you could write a completely different talk about that and its implications. That's not the talk I'm doing now, that's just about the destruction horizon. And the other trench we found on the Pythos. We also found some rim weights. This is an example of one. But to get back to this trench and the other areas, it became pretty clear that what we were excavating Bosanquet's dump in these upper levels. We got down to the lower level, we're actually excavating an abandonment horizon. But above that was the dump created by Bosanquet when he was excavating how the so-called Andreon and other houses further up the hill. So it's a kind of reverse stratigraphy. It's not precisely reverse stratigraphy, it's a kind of reverse stratigraphy. And in this dump, in this particular trench, we found these things. These are 2 terracotta plaques. This has pretty good parallels with others found by Halbert and Bosanquet in various sanctuary sites. This particular plaque doesn't have any parallels, exact parallels, but it does have, it's clearly part of an iconographic series related to Praisos. So we find this earlier example, we have plenty of these examples which have ended up in the British Museum, the Louvre, Metropolitan Museum of Art, and virtually everywhere. There's this example, which clearly succeeds from this. You get this guy with a plumed helmet and a shield with a ram's head on it, and this is what we seem to have here. And this, it's not very clear from this photograph, but this seems to be a ram's head shield and a plume and something going on here. I don't know what this means. I can't, iconography, I can't work out by pure iconography what this means, but it does seem to be something that's meaningful, would have been meaningful to people in ancient Praisos. And the other thing I want to point out is that in the upper levels, if you were excavating some of these sanctuary sites around Praisos, such as the so-called Fountain of Value, you get a whole range of female figurines, nude so-called Astarte figurines, figurines with a high polos, etc. Nothing like that was found in our 2007 excavations. 2 rather masculine figurines were found in the dump. I think you see where I'm going with this. And we also found lots and lots of pottery. And about 20% of the pottery was of the kind of characteristic classical Cretan drinking cup, either the high neck cup or the low neck cup. Sorry, back to this one. So this is the characteristic neck shoulder joint of these things. These things are very thin walled, they're very highly fired, very nicely fired, but they have walls of about 3 millimeters thick. So they can't have been used for very long, I think. I think something that thin would have broken fairly quickly. So there must be a fairly high turnover of these things. But 20% of the assemblage with these cups. So some of these things seem to be Attic imports. The vast majority were local Cretan products. We could identify this by looking macroscopically. We haven't done any technological work on this, so when I say fabrics, there are 3 fabrics that sort of jump out at you as look handling materials. There are 3 cover to these cups. And they seem to be classical, maybe into the 3rd century BC, although we haven't found anything that we can definitely say is classical. Now, just in terms of what people expect from the classical period, people expect this red figure. This is our sole fragment of red figure. That's it. So it's 1 out of 24,147 sherds, or 0.0004% of the assemblage. I show this to our students just so we can get the idea that everything in classical period is red figure out of their heads, because it's certainly not true at our site. So lots of drinking cups. The drinking is going on, associations with masculinity are going on, and it's all taking place probably in relation to this very big building, which is much bigger than your average house. Masculine association with drinking, something bigger than your average house. Okay. This is what we did up until 2013. And here we come to performance. We did keep bones, but it wasn't until 2013 that I could actually persuade my colleague in Cardiff, Richard Maverick, to come out and have a look at bones with us, which he did. And he managed to identify. It's not a huge percentage, it's smaller again than you've got a much bigger percentage of the Zoria, I think. Have you done this? Yeah. But it's large enough, I think, to draw some kind of statistical conclusions from it. And, well, in some sense, what do you expect from the site in Crete? Loads of caprins, that's the lowest you can go. Certain amount of pig, certain amount of cattle. But this isn't what you'd expect from your average assemblage. If it was just an assemblage that was to do with domestic consumption and maximising calorific value. This is what we've got an extraordinarily high number of, and that's the number of identified specimens here, and that's the minimum number of individuals. I think when I again earlier talked in track there, and people ask, what's a lagging? Well, a lagwolf is a hare or rabbit, and in this particular case, it's a hare, it's not a rabbit. Rabbits, I think, come into the rabbits, and they come from Spain, and these things, we're pretty sure they're not rabbits. We're pretty sure they're hares. This is some comparisons. These comparisons are done again by my colleague Richard Madrick, and he said this is a joint paper between myself and Richard Madrick. So, looking at the various sizes of the so-called published things, it's very much based on Jane Louis' very, very useful article in the Crete Cyprus volume that I got to it. Very, very, very useful article. If you want to know anything about this kind of the wild fauna of Crete, go to that article. And this gives a variety of things in the 8th century down to the 1st century AD, showing you sheep, goat, pig, cattle. And again, what I just want to show you here in terms of, the one button, is the very high proportion of other that we get at Praisos. A lot of this other are these lagonals or hares. So this is an assemblage with an unusually high proportion of a species that has to be hunted. You can't domesticate hares, you have to hunt them. Again, this is looking at the sheep-goat ratios. We have, this is something that interested Richard more than interested me, but we have a much, I think, sheep to goat, we have, this seems to be the ratio of sheep to goats quite high in other sanctuaries here and lower in our particular one. So it's again distinctive in that sense too. Marine shells, we couldn't explain. In nutritional terms, these are of no value whatsoever. So what they're doing in R7, we don't know. But they're not there. They can only be there to add flavour. But I've asked people, do these things add flavour? And so no, they track from the flavour of whatever you're eating. So they may just be chance finds. It's also clear that the butchering practices, and again, Richard Madrid would be the expert here rather than me, are not of a kind where you maximise caloric value. So in contrast to, say, the assemblage from Geometric Cavusi Castro, which was published a long time by Snyder and Clipple, I think, where they broke the bones and got down to the marrow and extracted maximum caloric value from the animal. This doesn't seem to be what's going on here. We seem to have butchery practices that involve quite a lot of fat, not too much disarticulation. So you're keeping big joints, so they're killing the animal and they're having big joints which are then distributed. It's not, stews, which is what seems to be going on. If we're using the standard Cretan tripod cooking vessel, we were making stews, that's what you get. You get sort of mashed up, lots of little tiny little bones, and lots of marrow extraction. But this is not what's happening here. Where we're getting big joints that have been consumed maybe in a kind of more ostentatious, performative way. Again, this is the so very little burnt, chopped, or cut. And this is a nice thing. We almost have a complete. Remember, this is a redeposited deposit, and yet in one of our Zembles, when we had a complex Zemble system, we had almost a complete sheep skeleton, which we hope was around. So that's really the slightly interpretation. So an almost complete skeleton is here with very, very large bones, and shown that the hospital will be cut up in big joints. And some dog bones. What's the significance of dog? Well, if you're hunting hare, you need dogs. The two go together, as I hope to have shown in and we had a very old dog, one that clearly hadn't been, not used to dog meat. It's been cared for throughout its life. So this is a dog that's been cared for and could hardly have eaten by the time, hardly had any teeth by the time it died. So at least a fairly elderly dog, 10-year-old dog or something like that. So that's the technical term I'm not going to bore you with. Okay. Wild fauna and feral fauna. Now, so we've got these at least 11 hares. That's the minimum number of individuals, possibly more hares. These are quite big animals. There's no deer. We also have some very large caprins. Those of you who know Crete, the largest caprin on Crete is the feral, strictly speaking, feral, not wild, agrimi. We don't have any agrimi horns, but we have some very big goats. And they're, I think, too big to be, well, they're at the upper limit of the domestic, the range, the size we expected they were purely domestic goats. So it might well be, and we would like to say that they are, agrimi. This is a view of the picture of the Cretan feral goat. Strictly speaking, it's a feral creature because it came over in the Neolithic and then went wild. It wasn't a wild, native inhabitant of Crete. What's the sex distribution? The sex distribution, most of the animals being consumed, as far as we can tell, are, with some exceptions like that big U skeleton I showed you before, male rather than female animals. So we have a strong emphasis on consumption of male animals. There are sample problems here. If Richard Madden here was saying, well, yes, male animals tend to be bigger, therefore they have bigger bones, therefore there's a sample size problem, so this is skewed in some ways towards this particular pattern is skewed. So maybe we've got a picture that's more like that. We still have a predominance of male animals, I think. Okay, back to hares. If you know anything about Greek literature, you've read Xenophon's analysis, you know that ancient Greeks were very keen on hunting hares. Xenophon's analysis, it goes off. Every time he gets some free time, it goes hunting hares with dogs. And this seems to run through many aspects of Greek literature. And it's an idea that clearly goes back to the Archaic period, and something we find on a whole variety of earlier images, so talking about iconography, on a large number of these proto-Corinthian arabella, which are very, very small things. This one, the Macmillan arabalis, what do we find in the lower register? A hare being hunted by a dog. What do we find here on this bird in arabalis? Again, dogs and dogs. I think there's a hare there. And what do we find on the chigivas? Turns up in Italy, but manufactured in Corinth. Hoplites, hunting lions, and then again hunting hares. So this is tied up with notions of masculinity in many parts of Greece from a very early date. This idea of hunting hares, and of course, you know, one Crete, and you've been there in September, and you've been trying to survey the uplands, you often encounter groups of men with guns and dogs hunting hares. You might actually get shot at. It's been happening once or twice in survey teams. But they're not. After cavalry, they're hunting hares. But you after cavalry also have guns, no problem. And you also find this in Cretan iconography. This is a closed vessel, it's not a cup. It was published by Coldstream, who decided it was a deer and a lion. If we looked at it again, indebted here to Peter Callahan, to have a look at it again, and he thinks it's a dog and a hare. I think you can tell this is a hare by his big ears here. So this hairing of dogs and hares you find in iconography turns up in Crete in the period we're talking about, in the sort of 3rd century BC. And again, this is Peter Callahan's, and that is redrawn by a colleague of mine in Cardiff. What's the significance, other significance of hares? Again, if you go back to the iconography, so we go to the Mammals painter. Here are two Maenads, here is Dionysus, and the Maenads are presenting Dionysus with a hare. Here's another picture where we have an Erastes and Eromos, two male lover, elder lover, younger lover, and he's presenting him with a hare. So that's the other significance of these particular animals. And if you've read the relevant passage in Strabo, you know where I'm going. And this is why I'm going to Campesini. And it's a pity that I think everything is Bessie's in the HDX, Campesini, and you have a wonderful publication of these particular plaques which date from the Archaic into the Classical period. This is an example from the Dictaean cave found by Hogarth. This is an example from Sikron. It shows these two male bonding going on. And this is as exactly what is technically described by Strabo, this practice of forming bands between young men where homosexuality was compulsory. You had to go out into the wild and hunt something and bring that to your lover and present him or her with, in this case, an agrini. But in other cases, some cases, a hare. This is one plaque A10. You can see this man has got a hare and an agrini being presented, presumably some kind of a love gift. And this seems to tie in with Strabo's and Ephros' description of how these male bonding took place in archaic Crete. So that's what I think was actually going on at our site. This kind of male bonding, cemented through feasting, creating a citizen body. So through various Andrea, you create a citizen body. Through feasting, through commensality, through hunting, going out to the wild and consuming the wild back in the centre of the your political community, you are creating a citizen body, partly through what might be called ritualised commensality. It's also again deep down that who pointed directly in the direction of this particular image. Clearly been thinking about this also for some time. And we have more of these particular plaques in Campesini, which we have the university has published. Some show rams. There's also some mention of all the other greenies or goats being given as love gifts. Now, I said earlier that we mustn't think of the Andreon as necessarily being attached to a particular place or a particular building. And we may have an earlier manifestation of it here. This is from the survey. This is a site we came across in the survey, but which have been visited, we later found out from using lots of people who visited by Sprat, who thought it might be the site of the temple of Cretane's use. It's what we call Prophetus Elias. And you go up there, and what you find, you can't miss this, and you go to the top, but still, it's obviously you find numerous cup bases. Just hundreds of them, all over this site, which is a very exposed site. It's the windiest place in our survey. You go up there, the wind hits you. It's not sheltered. And yet we find all these cups, so presumably drinking must have taken place on the exposed mountaintop. And we can date these cups, or rather Bryce Erickson has plausibly dated them to the end of the 6th century BC. So this is a mid-6th century cup here, and this one here is a kind of early classical cup. So these are earlier than the kinds of cups we're finding in our site. This is something earlier. So this would, my argument would be that before this particular place was established in the middle of the city, they are going out to the wild or exposed place, doing some heavy drinking, boldly drinking, disposing of the cups. There are really hundreds of these things all over the site. You go on collecting them forever. In the most exposed and kind of agricole, Crete and agricole place that you find in this area, which ties us back to the masculine iconography we found in our French. So, even though, as I said, if all our studies, even though this whole thing is about male bonding and creating male citizens, it's characteristic that every year I get a large number of female students coming out to study themselves. So what that tells you about the difference between the ancient world and modern world, I'm not quite sure. So it's certainly a striking difference between these are the 4 students we have this year and a whole succession of students. So several study students which were intersected with Colin and others. And here, this here is Richard Madrick, who's responsible for much of the animal zone study here. So to sum up, I think we have good evidence for ritualised commensality in Praisos. There's a problem that we're dealing with both in case dump, but we do seem to have coherent deposits. We can't say where exactly these deposits come from, but there do seem to be coherent associations of groups of drinking cups with particular deposits of animal bones. And once we get down to the fine grain, we'll be able to say, where do these, are hairs more likely to be associated with drinking cups than with other vessels? We can't quite say that yet, but I think we've got the stratigraphic detail to sort of pin that down with a little bit more analysis. So that's the next stage of what we want to do. And we would like in the future, possibly with Matthew Henderson, who's now got a position in Newcastle, to go back and do a bit more excavating so we can test some of these hypotheses a bit more conclusively. And of course, I have quite a lot of people to thank from this institution called Crete Athens, Cardiff, it's not the geography history, but they fund us. South Countries, Packard Humanities Institute helped to pay for the land, the second time we had to school land. Everyone else has helped us since 1992 onwards. Thank you for your attention.